The Atlantic Ocean in the early 1940s was a place of both silence and terror. To the untrained eye, it appeared endless and calm, a cold expanse stretching beyond the horizon. Yet beneath its surface and across its windswept waves, one of the most crucial struggles of the Second World War was unfolding. Merchant ships formed into convoys, sailing in tight formation, each one carrying food, fuel, and weapons essential for Britain's survival. Their decks were often crowded with nervous sailors, men who knew that at any moment the stillness of the sea could erupt into violence. The lifeline of an entire nation depended on these journeys, and each voyage felt like a desperate throw of the dice. For Britain, isolated after the fall of France in 1940, the sea was both a shield and a weakness. It protected the island from invasion, yet also left it dependent on supplies from across the Atlantic. Without constant shipments of grain, steel, and ammunition, Britain would wither. London could endure bombs falling from the sky, but without food on the table and bullets at the front, its fight could not last. The nation's survival was tied not to the glamour of air battles, but to the steady beat of propellers pushing cargo ships across treacherous waters. These convoys were not just supply routes, they were the very arteries of the war effort. Imagine being one of the young sailors aboard a merchant vessel. You stood on the deck at night, the wind biting through your coat, staring into the blackness ahead. Around you, other ships moved in silence, their lights extinguished to avoid detection. Somewhere in that darkness, German U-boats lurked, patient and deadly. A torpedo could strike without warning, sending steel and men alike to the bottom within minutes. The ocean was unforgiving, swallowing screams and wreckage with equal indifference. Yet the sailors endured, knowing that Britain's fate rested on their courage. To the world beyond the sea, these convoys seemed ordinary, almost invisible. Newsreels showed bombed cities and heroic pilots, but the long columns of merchant ships rarely appeared on the screen. Their battles were hidden, fought in the dark with little glory and no cheering crowds. Still, within military headquarters and among Allied leaders, the importance of these convoys was understood with grim clarity. If Britain's supply lines snapped, the war would be lost. Every ship that slipped safely into port carried not just cargo, but the hope of a nation. The Atlantic itself added to the danger. Storms could scatter convoys, tossing ships like toys in a child's bath. Icebergs and fog could blind navigators, forcing vessels off course. Even without the threat of U-boats, the journey was punishing, leaving crews exhausted and constantly on edge. In winter, the cold was brutal, freezing ropes and stiffening hands until even the simplest task became agony. The sailors lived in a world where nature itself seemed to conspire with the enemy. Yet, despite the hardship, they returned again and again to their ships. In this setting, the Battle of the Atlantic was not defined by sweeping charges or dramatic clashes, but by endurance. It was a battle measured in miles crossed and cargo delivered, in nights spent awake scanning the horizon, and in the dull thud of depth charges echoing through the hull. For Britain, every convoy that arrived meant one more day of resistance, one more chance to stand firm against the Axis. For the men at sea, survival was never guaranteed, but the mission remained clear. Their task was simple yet monumental: to keep the lifeline open, no matter the cost. The early years of the conflict painted a stark picture. Britain was hanging by a thread, and the Atlantic was its last connection to survival. This was the hook on which the fate of nations swung, a story that unfolded far from the headlines, but determined the course of the war. The convoys represented a quiet heroism, a battle fought in silence and shadow. As the war progressed, this struggle would only intensify, drawing in more ships, more men, and more danger. Yet even here, at the start, it was clear that the Atlantic was the true front line of survival. While the skies above Europe roared with the engines of bombers, the seas told a different story. The world's attention was often drawn to the drama of aerial raids, the flashes of anti-aircraft fire, and the smoldering ruins of cities. Newspapers printed images of destruction from above, feeding the impression that victory or defeat hinged on the bombers alone. Yet within the Axis High Command, a far greater fear lingered. It was not the bombers they dreaded most, but the relentless, silent progress of the Allied convoys across the Atlantic. The contrast between spectacle and substance could not have been greater. Bombing campaigns caused devastation, but factories could be rebuilt and production could resume. The German war machine knew this bitter truth well, as its cities endured waves of destruction only to see them rise again with remarkable speed. What could not be so easily replaced, however, was the steady flow of resources carried by the convoys. With every successful crossing, Britain's factories remained supplied, its armies remained fed, and its people endured. The bombers could destroy, but the convoys sustained, and that made them infinitely more dangerous in the long war. For German generals and naval commanders, this difference was deeply unsettling. U-boats prowled the Atlantic with orders to sink merchant shipping above all else. To them, the war at sea was not about glory, but about cutting arteries. They understood that if the convoys were severed, Britain would starve and its war effort would collapse. Yet each time they struck, the Allies adapted, strengthening their escorts and tightening their defenses. The convoys, once seen as vulnerable prey, grew into a formidable obstacle, and the Axis realized that they were facing an enemy that could not be broken easily. To the sailors of those convoys, the contrast was felt in more personal terms. They knew the bombs falling on London were terrifying, but they also knew the supplies they carried meant those cities could recover. Standing on the deck of a merchant ship, hearing the distant rumble of depth charges or the sudden roar of an exploding tanker was to understand the war in a way civilians never could. It was not about headlines or photographs, but about survival and persistence. The convoys represented the quiet strength of ordinary men holding the line where it mattered most. This hidden battle highlighted the difference between destruction and endurance. Bombers might scatter rubble across a city, but convoys rebuilt it by ensuring tools, steel, and timber kept arriving. Bombers might break morale for a night, but convoys restored it by keeping food on the shelves. For the Axis, the lesson was brutal and clear. They could destroy as much as they wanted from the air, but as long as the convoys endured, Britain would stand. The heart of the war lay not in the skies, but in the shipping lanes, and it was this reality that shaped strategy on both sides. In the end, this contrast became a defining feature of the war itself. To the public, bombers represented power and vengeance. To the generals, convoys represented survival and victory. The fear of Allied shipping lines never stopped haunting German leadership, for they knew that as long as the lifeline remained unbroken, the war could never be won on their terms. It was this hidden struggle, often overlooked in the shadows of more dramatic events, that determined the true balance of power in the Second World War. The system of convoys was not a new idea, yet in the early years of the Second World War, it became the very backbone of Britain's survival. Surrounded by the vast waters of the Atlantic, the island nation had always relied on imports. Before the war, ships arrived daily carrying food, oil, and raw materials, feeding the factories that powered its economy. But once war erupted, every ship that crossed the ocean became a target. German submarines stalked the waters, seeking to strangle Britain into submission by cutting off these supplies. It was in this dire context that the convoy system, long considered a defensive necessity, was expanded into a lifeline of global significance. From the beginning, Britain's leaders understood that their island could not endure without overseas aid. The fall of France in 1940 left Britain standing alone in Europe, exposed and vulnerable. Its fields could not produce enough food to feed the population, and its industries could not maintain full capacity without constant imports of coal, steel, and oil. The sea was the only highway connecting Britain to the outside world. As a result, the merchant fleet, once seen as secondary to the Royal Navy's battleships and cruisers, suddenly became the most important force in the nation's defense. Imagine the scene at ports along the American and Canadian coasts, where convoys prepared for departure. Cargo ships lined the harbors, their holds filled with crates of weapons, vehicles, and sacks of grain. Sailors went about their work in silence, fully aware of the dangers awaiting them across the Atlantic. Naval escorts stood ready, destroyers and corvettes bristling with depth charges and sonar equipment. It was a picture of coordination, an effort that combined the courage of civilian crews with the discipline of naval protection. These convoys were not just logistical arrangements, they were acts of defiance against the Axis blockade. The United States, though still neutral at the start of the war, became a central figure in this effort. Its vast industrial capacity began supplying Britain even before America's official entry into the conflict. The factories of Detroit and Pittsburgh, the farms of the Midwest, and the shipyards along the coasts all contributed to the steady stream of supplies. Yet production alone was not enough. Without ships to carry goods safely across the ocean, American output would remain useless. Thus, the convoy system was the bridge that transformed raw industrial power into actual strength on the battlefield. The origins of this system revealed a deeper truth about modern warfare. Victories would not only be won by tanks and planes, but by the unbroken flow of resources. A single convoy could carry the material needed to feed a city or to arm an army for weeks. Every arrival in British ports meant that the war effort could continue, regardless of how many bombs fell from the skies. It was this reliance on logistics, carefully planned and relentlessly executed, that would define the Allied strategy. To the Axis, the convoys represented a frustrating paradox. They appeared slow and vulnerable, an inviting target for submarines and aircraft. Yet the more the Germans attacked, the more the Allies improved their defenses. It was a system that adapted constantly, learning from losses and responding with stronger measures. What began as a fragile link across the ocean became a fortified chain, increasingly difficult to break. The origins of the convoy system, rooted in necessity, grew into a symbol of Allied determination. By the middle years of the war, the convoy system was firmly established as the lifeblood of the Allied effort. Its beginnings were marked by desperation, yet its persistence was a testament to resilience. Britain had faced the grim possibility of starvation and collapse, but through the courage of sailors and the vision of leaders, the convoys turned that weakness into strength. The origins of this strategy remind us that wars are not only fought with weapons, but with foresight and the will to endure. In the end, it was not the speed of planes or the strength of tanks that kept Britain alive, but the simple, steady movement of ships across a dangerous sea. As the convoys began to sail regularly across the Atlantic, their influence reached far beyond the docks of Liverpool or the shipyards of Halifax. Their impact could be felt directly on the battlefields where soldiers fought and nations struggled for survival. Each shipment of food, fuel, and weapons transformed into strength at the front lines. A convoy that successfully arrived in Britain meant British troops could hold their rifles, pilots could fly their aircraft, and factories could continue producing. Without this constant stream of supplies, the armies in Europe and North Africa would have faced shortages that no amount of bravery could overcome. For the British people, the arrival of a convoy was more than a logistical event. It was a lifeline. Imagine a family in London during the Blitz, emerging from an air raid shelter after a night of bombing. Their home may have been damaged, the city scarred, but when they went to collect their weekly rations, there was still bread, tea, and sugar. These small comforts existed because merchant ships had crossed the ocean and survived. Behind every loaf of bread and every gallon of fuel lay the courage of sailors who risked torpedoes and storms to deliver them. On the battlefield and at home, convoys sustained both survival and morale. For the Axis, the impact was felt as frustration. German U-boat crews often celebrated sinking a tanker or freighter, but those victories proved fleeting. No matter how many ships they struck, the Allies adapted, sending more vessels and better escorts. Slowly, the Germans realized that the flow of supplies could not be completely stopped. Every torpedo that missed, Every depth charge that forced a submarine to dive meant another convoy slipped through their net. To the German High Command, this was infuriating. Their strategy had been to starve Britain into surrender. Yet the convoys kept the island nation alive, undermining their grand designs. On the front lines, the presence of Allied supplies could be the difference between holding ground or retreating. In the deserts of North Africa, tanks rolled forward because fuel had arrived across the sea. In the skies above Britain, fighters could continue patrolling because convoys brought in the aviation fuel that kept them airborne. Even as German bombers struck at ports and railways, the steady rhythm of deliveries meant that Britain always had the ability to recover. Soldiers understood that the unseen battle at sea mattered just as much as the one fought face to face with the enemy. The sailors themselves were rarely recognized as soldiers, yet their work was no less vital. A single torpedo could end their lives in a matter of seconds, and many never returned home. Those who survived spoke of nights filled with fear, listening for the hum of aircraft or the splash of a periscope breaking the surface. And yet, their sacrifices shaped the battlefield in ways that could not always be measured in medals or parades. Every shipment that arrived gave generals the confidence to plan offensives, gave armies the tools to fight, and gave civilians the strength to endure. This hidden connection between the convoy routes and the battlefields revealed the true nature of modern war. It was not only about guns firing or tanks advancing, but about supply lines that reached across oceans. Logistics became the foundation upon which victories were built. Without the convoys, Britain would have collapsed, and the wider Allied war effort would have faltered. With them, the fight continued, stronger with each passing month. The battlefield victories of the Allies were carried first across the ocean in the dark hulls of merchant ships braving the most dangerous waters in the world. The convoys did not merely feed soldiers or keep aircraft in the skies. Their success had wider consequences that reached deep into the hearts of nations. For Britain, the knowledge that ships continued to arrive in its ports gave its people the courage to endure the unrelenting pressures of war. Even as bombs fell on London, Coventry, and other cities, the sight of imported goods on store shelves reminded civilians that they were not alone. Families rationed their food carefully, but the very fact that bread, sugar, and tea continued to appear was proof that their lifeline across the Atlantic was unbroken. Morale depended as much on these supplies as on any military victory. The convoys also influenced the politics of war. In the United States, the steady stream of material assistance to Britain before America officially entered the conflict helped shape public opinion. Each shipment represented a growing bond between the two nations, turning what had once been a cautious partnership into a shared destiny. American industrial power mattered little without the convoys to carry it overseas. As these ships sailed, they carried not only cargo, but the message that Britain and America were tied together in the fight against tyranny. This sense of unity deepened as the war progressed, eventually bringing Canada, Australia, and other allies into a vast network of cooperation. For Germany, the consequences were both strategic and psychological. The Luftwaffe's bombers could destroy factories and homes, but those strikes did not stop the supplies from arriving. Each convoy that reached its destination made German efforts at starvation and blockade look weaker. U-boat commanders returned from long patrols claiming victories, but their successes could never match the relentless scale of Allied resupply. German generals recognized this growing imbalance and began to see that they could not win by naval disruption alone. The sense of frustration grew with each failed attempt to break the Allied lifeline. The wider consequences of the convoys were also felt on the battlefield, though indirectly. Generals planned campaigns with confidence, knowing supplies would continue to arrive. Troops could train with live ammunition rather than conserve every bullet, and air forces could maintain constant patrols without fearing shortages. Even after heavy losses in battle, the Allies could quickly replace equipment because convoys carried more across the ocean. This steady rhythm of replenishment gave the Allies a resilience that the Axis lacked. War became a contest of endurance, and the convoys gave the Allies the strength to last longer. In Britain itself, the survival of the convoys shaped the very spirit of the nation. Citizens heard reports of sinkings, of men lost to the sea, and yet the goods still came. This quiet reassurance carried enormous symbolic weight. It showed that Britain was not isolated, that the ocean was not a barrier, but a bridge connecting them to the wider world. In every loaf of bread and every gallon of oil, the public saw proof that their island could resist. The convoys gave ordinary people the confidence to keep working, to keep fighting, and to keep believing in eventual victory. Perhaps the greatest consequence of the convoys was the shift in how war itself was understood. Traditional victories were measured by land gained or cities captured. Yet here was a different kind of triumph, won not by charging armies, but by stubborn persistence. The convoys demonstrated that logistics, organization, and unity could shape the outcome of a global conflict as surely as any battlefield maneuver. Their survival kept Britain alive, kept the Allies supplied, and forced the Axis into a war they could not win. This quiet, steady effort created a foundation that would carry the Allies toward ultimate victory. By the middle years of the war, the convoy system had reached its most decisive point. The Atlantic no longer felt like a place where survival was uncertain, but rather the stage where the Allies proved their endurance against relentless assault. Convoys stretched across the horizon, escorted by destroyers, corvettes, and aircraft that scanned the waters for hidden threats. Every journey was still dangerous, yet the balance had begun to shift. The German U-boat fleet, once feared as the wolf packs of the sea, found itself increasingly hunted. What had started as a deadly contest now leaned toward Allied dominance. For the men aboard the merchant ships, the climax of the struggle was deeply personal. Nights remained tense, the sea black and silent, every shadow a possible periscope. But there was also a growing sense of confidence. Where once the sailors had felt like prey, now they felt protected by escorts and supported by coordinated defense. Imagine standing on deck, hearing the reassuring thrum of a warship nearby, its guns ready, its crew alert. The danger had not disappeared, but it no longer felt inevitable. Hope replaced despair, and endurance transformed into quiet defiance. For the Axis commanders, the climax carried an opposite weight. Their strategy of starving Britain into submission faltered in the face of sheer persistence. Convoys continued to arrive, bringing more supplies than ever before. German submarines still struck, sinking ships and killing sailors, but the numbers no longer favored them. Each lost submarine weakened the U-boat arm irreparably, while Allied production replaced ships at a pace Germany could not match. What once seemed like a winning strategy became a slow bleed, draining resources and morale. The climax of the Atlantic battle was the realization that the tide had turned. The Allied High Command understood the magnitude of this moment. With the convoys secured, plans for larger offensives could move forward. Supplies flowed not only to Britain, but across the Mediterranean, and eventually to the staging grounds for the liberation of Europe. The D-Day landings in Normandy years later would not have been possible without the secure chain of supplies that crossed the Atlantic. Every tank that rolled ashore, every soldier who stepped onto the beaches was there because the convoys had won their war. This was the unseen triumph, the foundation beneath the visible victories. The climax was not marked by a single dramatic battle or one decisive victory. Instead, it was the accumulation of countless journeys, countless nights, where ships pressed on despite storms, submarines, and bombs. It was the victory of persistence, of endurance over destruction. When the tide finally turned, it was clear that Germany could no longer dictate the pace of the war at sea. The convoys had grown too strong, too coordinated, and too resilient to be broken. Their survival meant that Britain's survival was no longer in doubt. At this peak of struggle, the true nature of power in modern war was revealed. It was not simply the number of guns or tanks that mattered, but the ability to keep them supplied and moving. The climax of the convoy battle was the recognition that logistics had defeated strategy, that endurance had outlasted aggression. For the men at sea, it was a hard-won vindication of their sacrifices. For the Allies as a whole, it was the moment when survival transformed into momentum. From this point forward, the war would move inexorably toward Allied victory. When the last shots of the Battle of the Atlantic faded and the seas grew quiet again, the convoys had already written their legacy. Britain had endured not because its cities had withstood the firestorms of bombs, but because its lifeline across the ocean had never been severed. The convoys carried more than grain and steel, more than tanks and trucks. They carried the promise that Britain would not fight alone, that across the waves, an entire world was rallying to its side. In the end, survival was not owed to spectacle in the skies, but to the steady, unglamorous persistence of ships plowing through storm and fire. For the sailors who served on these convoys, the legacy was deeply personal. Many never returned, their names remembered in naval rolls and memorials, their ships resting at the bottom of the cold Atlantic. Those who survived carried memories of fear, exhaustion, and loss, but also of pride. They knew their work had kept millions alive and had made ultimate victory possible. Imagine a veteran standing years later at a quiet port, watching modern vessels depart, and remembering the nights when silence was broken by torpedoes and depth charges. Their sacrifice was not in vain. For the Allies as a whole, the convoys left a lesson etched into history. Wars are not won by destruction alone, but by endurance. The ability to move supplies across oceans and keep armies fed and armed proved more decisive than any single bombing raid. It was logistics, organization, and cooperation that shaped the outcome of the war. The convoys revealed the true weight of unity, with nations working together across vast distances to hold the line. In that sense, their legacy was not only military but political, laying the foundation for future alliances. Even for Germany, the convoys cast a long shadow. The U-boat war had been their great hope of victory, a weapon to choke Britain into submission. Its failure left the Axis weakened, unable to match the scale and endurance of Allied supply lines. What German generals had feared most turned out to be true. Bombers could inflict pain, but convoys delivered victory. This quiet, relentless power of supply revealed the limits of aggression and the strength of persistence. Today, when historians look back at the Second World War, the convoys stand as a reminder of the hidden struggles that shape great conflicts. They remind us that behind every battlefield triumph lay an unbroken chain of effort, carried out by ordinary men on extraordinary missions. Their courage ensured that Britain survived, that Europe could be liberated, and that the Allies could prevail. Their story is one of endurance, sacrifice, and triumph over despair. The legacy of the Atlantic convoys endures not in monuments of stone, but in the understanding that strength lies in resilience. It is the story of ships sailing into darkness with no certainty of return, of men who fought not with rifles or cannons, but with determination and faith. Theirs was a victory without spectacle, yet it changed the course of the war. Long after the last convoy sailed, the lesson remained clear. Persistence and cooperation can overcome even the most relentless campaigns of destruction.